You do not hold a river line with a single battalion. Every commander knows this. Every manual states it plainly. A lone infantry battalion, barely 700 men on paper, cannot stop a multi-division assault. It cannot stall an entire army, and it certainly cannot hold a valley once the enemy has massed tens of thousands of troops for a breakthrough. That was the rule. It was baked into NATO thinking, into UN doctrine, into every war college lecture that tried to quantify the limits of human endurance under fire. When the Chinese People's Volunteer Army launched a major offensive, the expectation was simple. Their numbers would decide the outcome. 20-to-1 odds do not invite heroism, they crush it. And the Chinese commanders knew this too. They had smashed larger UN formations. They had forced retreats along the entire peninsula. They believed, reasonably, that no small unit could survive once the tidal wave of their night attacks began rolling. But in April 1951, on a bend of the Imjin River, that universal rule met a single company-sized element of British infantry. 2 understrength platoons dug into a ridge line, and it shattered. Because one man, a 23-year-old lieutenant named Terry Waters, stepped into a valley that should have been his grave and refused to yield. And in doing so, he changed the course of a battle, shocked the Chinese command, and carved one of the Korean War's most enduring legends. Lieutenant Terry Waters was not born for legend. He was born in 1928, raised in a quiet English town, and like most young officers of his generation, shaped by the shadow of the Second World War. He grew up hearing stories of the Somme, Ypres, Arnhem, stories where tiny units endured impossible odds because retreat simply wasn't an option. By 1951, he was an officer in the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment, the Gloucesters, a unit steeped in centuries of tradition, a regiment that had marched under Wellington in Spain, stood at Waterloo and fought through the carnage of the Western Front. The Gloucesters prided themselves on steadiness, ordinary men who became extraordinary only when the moment demanded it, and Korea was such a moment. By the spring of 1951, the war had shifted again. After brutal winter offensives, the Chinese had poured across the peninsula, forcing UN forces back. Now in April, they prepared a new hammer blow, the Spring Offensive. Estimates later showed more than 330,000 Chinese troops massed across the front. Their goal was to smash through UN lines, seize Seoul again, and force negotiations from a position of strength. The Imjin River was one of the crossing points. Holding it fell to the British 29th Brigade, barely 4,000 men, spread thin across miles of hills, ridges, and villages. And on one of those ridges, Hill 235, Lieutenant Waters and his depleted platoon took up positions. Their job was simple on paper: delay the Chinese long enough for the brigade to fall back in good order. But even before the first shot, Waters understood the truth. With only 600 to 700 combat-effective Gloucesters on the line, facing nearly 3 Chinese divisions, delay might turn into stand. Stand might turn into sacrifice. So what does a 23-year-old lieutenant do, knowing he and his men are being asked to hold back an army? He checks his men's ammunition. He confirms firing arcs. He walks the ridge line and looks into the darkness across the Imjin. And he waits. The Chinese would not attack in daylight. They preferred night, thousands of silhouettes emerging in silence until the valley erupted. Waters knew it. Every Gloucester knew it. On the night of April 22, 1951, the hills trembled with the sound of distant bugles. The offensive had begun. The Chinese struck the entire UN line, but the blow that mattered, the one designed to break open the valley, fell directly on the Gloucesters. Their position anchored the flank. If they collapsed, the 29th Brigade collapsed. If the brigade collapsed, Seoul lay open again. And so Lieutenant Waters and barely 30 men braced themselves on a small ridge, knowing the valley ahead held thousands. Here is where the rule should have reasserted itself. Here is where overwhelming numbers should have swept the ridge, crushed the platoon, and opened the route forward. But that is not what happened. As the clock passed midnight, Waters' forward scouts spotted movement, hundreds of shapes slipping through the trees toward the river. Chinese infiltration units. Waters radioed battalion headquarters. The answer came back calm. Hold your position, more are coming. At 1:00 a.m., the first Chinese assault hit the Gloucester's outposts. Machine guns opened, mortars thumped. Waters shouted orders, repositioning his Bren gunners as pressure rippled across the line. Then another wave came, and another, and another. By dawn, more than 10,000 Chinese troops had crashed against the broader Gloucester perimeter. The battalion was being encircled. Waters' platoon had now become the hinge of the defense. At first light, he saw what they faced: columns of Chinese infantry pouring into the valley, artillery flashes in the hills, movement on both flanks. The battalion's radio reports grew grim. Units were being pushed back. Casualties were rising. Ammunition was running low everywhere. Yet Waters still held his ridge. He knew the brigade was forming behind him, preparing a defensive line. If he gave way too soon, the entire 29th Brigade would be cut off. His small platoon, barely 30 rifles, was now the plug in a collapsing dam. And as Chinese pressure increased, Lieutenant Waters made the decision that would define the Gloucester's stand. He would not pull back. Not yet. Not while the brigade still needed precious hours. Behind him, the valley filled with the sounds of retreating vehicles, shouted orders, and wounded men being carried south. His platoon heard it all and understood what it meant. If they stayed, they might not leave, but they stayed. Because sometimes in war, the rule isn't what decides the outcome. The men do. And as the second night approached, Waters' small, exhausted, half-ammunition platoon prepared to face a force that outnumbered them hundreds to one. A force that fully expected to sweep them aside in minutes. Instead, they would be stopped cold, and China would be stunned. Night falls on April 23rd, and the ridge grows quiet, too quiet. Lieutenant Terry Waters knows what that means. The Chinese are repositioning, reorganizing, preparing to finish what they started. His platoon has taken casualties. Ammunition is lower than anyone wants to admit, and the battalion's perimeter has shrunk into a series of isolated pockets. But Waters stays on the ridge. His 30 men stay with him, and the valley waits. At 9:00 p.m., the first sound reaches them, the eerie, rising blare of Chinese attack bugles drifting through the dark. The men freeze. Waters raises a hand, listening, counting the notes. One pattern means probing attack. Another means full wave. What he hears now is the latter. Then the ground starts shaking. Chinese mortars bracket the hillside. Shrapnel snaps into trees. Dirt showers the men in their foxholes. Waters moves from position to position, checking fields of fire, adjusting arcs by inches. He tells the Bren gunner on the left flank to conserve ammunition until he gives the order. At 9:12 p.m. he sees them, black shapes rushing across the lower slope, dozens, then hundreds, then too many to count. He gives the order. The ridge explodes with fire. Bren guns spit in harsh, rhythmic bursts. Lee Enfield rifles crack again and again. Waters fires flares into the sky, illuminating a sea of charging silhouettes. The Chinese push forward in waves of 300 to 400, using the terrain to slip between kill zones, then massing again for sudden surges. But the Gloucesters hold. At 10:00 p.m., the Chinese shift tactics. Machine gun teams open up from the tree line below, raking the ridge. Waters feels rounds whip overhead, punching through branches. His right flank position reports 2 wounded. He crawls forward under fire, reorganizing the line. Then he sees movement, Chinese troops circling behind the ridge. They're trying to envelop. He reacts instantly. He pulls a section, only 6 men, off the forward slope and redirects them to intercept. The firefight is ferocious, close, desperate. Grenades burst in violent white flashes. Waters hears the metallic snap of bayonets being fixed. Men fight at 10 yards, then 5. The enemy breaks off, leaving bodies in the brush. But the message is clear. The Chinese are no longer attacking the ridge, they are swallowing it. Midnight approaches. Waters checks his watch. The men can barely see in the smoky darkness. Tracers carve green arcs across the valley. His radio crackles static, broken voices, then a message. Gloucester's hold as long as able, Brigade withdrawing behind you. He stares at the handset. Brigade is pulling back. The final line is forming miles behind him. Waters' platoon is no longer buying minutes, they're buying survival for thousands, and the Chinese know it. At 1:30 a.m., the largest wave yet slams into the ridge. Waters estimates 600 men in the first rush, with more behind. The air vibrates with their shouting. His men fire until barrels glow. Rifles jam from heat. Bren guns run dry again and again. The Chinese climb over their own fallen, pushing higher, closer. Then the ammunition runs critically low. Fix bayonets. Waters shouts. Metal clicks across the ridge. The Chinese reach the forward trench. Close quarters combat erupts, violent, chaotic, physical. Waters plunges into the fight, swinging, shoving, firing his pistol at point-blank range. His men form a knot around him, a shrinking island of resistance in a sea of bodies. The Chinese cannot believe the ridge is still holding, and for a moment neither can Waters. At 2:00 a.m. the attack pauses. The Chinese pull back to regroup. Waters takes stock. He has fewer than 20 men still able to fight. Several are wounded. Ammunition is measured in handfuls, not boxes, yet the ridge stands. But the next wave will break them. He knows it. He calls battalion headquarters. This time, Colonel Karn answers personally. Hold as long as you can, Terry. Every minute counts. Every minute. Every life on the ridge weighed against thousands behind them. Waters looks at his men, faces blackened by smoke, uniforms shredded, hands trembling from recoil and exhaustion. He wants to order a breakout. He wants to pull them back, regroup, fight again somewhere else. But the Chinese are all around them now. Escape is a fantasy. At 3:00 a.m. the final wave begins. It starts with mortars, dozens. Impacts march up the slope like footsteps of thunder. Trees explode into splinters. Foxholes vanish under cascades of dirt. Waters is thrown sideways, ears ringing. When he stands, the night is filled with moving shapes, hundreds, then more. They are coming for the ridge one last time. Stand to, he shouts. The remaining Gloucesters rise, steadying their weapons. The Chinese surge from three sides. They close to within 30 yards, 20, 15. Waters fires until his pistol is empty. Then he grabs a fallen rifle, works the bolt, fires again. 10 yards, 5, contact. The Chinese swarm the ridge. Waters rallies the survivors into a tight circle, fighting outward in every direction. He hears a man scream. He hears someone praying. He hears the relentless, unstoppable momentum of an army rolling over them. For the first time he understands, the ridge is lost. At 4:00 a.m., with ammunition gone, positions overrun, and the enemy flooding past them, Waters gives the order he never wanted to give. Break into small groups. Fight your way back if you can. Some try. Most are cut off immediately. Waters gathers a handful of wounded men and attempts to lead them down the ridge. They do not make it far. By dawn, the ridge is silent except for the sound of Chinese boots moving across it. Lieutenant Terry Waters is taken prisoner along with scattering survivors. Their stand has ended, but the Chinese do not celebrate. Not yet, because they do not understand what has happened. They do not understand why an entire division was delayed by a single isolated battalion. They do not understand how one understrength platoon held a valley long enough to alter the course of the battle. And as the sun rises over the Imjin, UN forces behind the Gloucesters complete their withdrawal in good order. They survive because a few dozen men refuse to run. If you find this kind of forgotten history as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of courage deserve to be told, And by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. The story, however, is far from over. Because what none of the Gloucesters knew, not Waters, not Colonel Carn, not any man on those ridges, was that their stand would echo across command posts, war rooms, and nations for decades to come. The ridge has fallen. The Gloucesters have been swallowed by the valley they refused to abandon. Lieutenant Terry Waters, wounded and exhausted, is now a prisoner marching north under guard. Around him are fragments of his platoon, men too injured to walk without help, men who haven't slept in 2 days, men who believed they would die on Hill 235. But the Chinese guards are not triumphant. They are confused, because while they succeeded in overwhelming the Gloucesters, something is very wrong with the battlefield behind them. Their timetable is shattered. Their assault routes are jammed. Their divisions, tens of thousands strong, have lost momentum, and momentum was everything in their doctrine. What they don't realize yet is that the stand of one British battalion has changed the shape of the entire offensive. Across the valley, UN commanders begin to understand the scale of what the Gloucesters accomplished. General James Van Fleet is stunned by reports filtering in. An entire Chinese army group stalled by a handful of hills, one of which was defended by fewer than 700 men. More importantly, the 29th Brigade succeeds in withdrawing intact. Thousands of lives saved, lines reformed, Seoul protected. The Chinese intended a breakthrough. Instead, they gained a ridge and lost the initiative. Chinese staff officers pore over maps, radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports. They calculate the losses, thousands dead attacking a position they expected to crush in hours. They search for the explanation. How did a single battalion delay 3 divisions? How did one isolated company hold an entire valley? Their internal reports reveal their shock. These enemy soldiers fought until no ammunition remained. These positions did not retreat even when surrounded. The resistance was beyond expectations. What they don't write, but officers later admit, is that they were not prepared for men who would rather die on a ridge than pull back an inch. And the Chinese paid for that miscalculation. Their spring offensive stalls across the front. Their formations outrun supply lines. Attacks lose cohesion. The advance that was supposed to roll to Seoul instead fractures. The Gloucesters didn't just hold a hill, they broke the rhythm of the offensive. But the greatest ripple is the one no one sees yet, the future of the Korean War itself. Because once the spring offensive fails, the war shifts. Negotiations begin to take shape. The line stabilizes. The frantic, sweeping maneuver phase of the conflict gives way to trench warfare and attrition. A single stand contributed to stopping the last major Chinese push of the war. And yet, while generals assess the consequences and governments consider the political impact, Lieutenant Waters faces a very different reality. He and his men are marched north, beyond the Imjin, beyond the lines, and into captivity. And what happens there will test him more cruelly than the battle ever did. Captivity begins immediately. The survivors are divided into groups. Officers are separated from enlisted men. The Chinese interrogators quickly identify Waters as a platoon leader, even though he's barely older than many of the corporals captured with him. His wounds worsen. Infection sets in. But what the Chinese want is not information about the Gloucesters. They already know what the battalion did. What they want is political confession, denunciation, obedience. The prison camp is a place designed to extract those things. Waters refuses, again and again and again, but there is a price. His health breaks. He is denied medical treatment. He is denied food at times, sleep at others. He is pressured to speak against the UN forces. He is pressured to sign a confession. He is pressured to abandon the men under his care. He does none of it. What he does instead is quietly encourage the younger soldiers. He reminds them of who they are, where they come from, why they fought. He holds the line in the only way left to him, not with a rifle, but with defiance. And the Chinese notice. In the prison logs, guards write, "This officer refuses all cooperation." This one encourages resistance among other prisoners. This lieutenant ignores instructions. They break many men in those camps. Terry Waters is not one of them. He dies there on August 28, 1951, at just 23 years old. The official report lists malnutrition. The men who saw him describe something closer to deliberate punishment. The war ends for him in captivity, far from Hill 235, far from home. But his story does not. The survivors return. They speak his name. They speak of his leadership on the ridge, of his defiance in the camps, of the way he faced down an army and then faced down torture with equal determination. In 1955, Lieutenant Terry Waters is awarded the George Cross. It remains one of the most revered honors given to any British soldier of the Korean War. Today, on Hill 235, once a nameless ridge, the memorial to the Gloucesters stands above the Imjin River. It marks the place where a single battalion stalled a Chinese army, where a few dozen men held an entire valley, where a 23-year-old lieutenant chose duty over survival. And that is why this story matters now. Because courage does not always come from grand strategy. Sometimes it comes from a platoon holding a ridge. Sometimes it comes from a wounded officer refusing to bow his head. Sometimes it comes from human beings who decide that a line will be held, not because it is possible, but because it is necessary. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state and tell us if someone in your family served. Thank you for ensuring that Lieutenant Terry Waters and the 700 men of the Gloucestershire Regiment do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.